China is the country that is most similar to the United States in the entire world. People think that they're these two alien civilizations, they're the clash of civilizations. No, it's a similar country. Everyone's just wearing khaki shorts and a t-shirt and Crocs and going to the mall and driving to the mall and watching, Fox News or whatever and saying like, my country's great cuz it's big, and then dreaming big unrealistic dreams of getting rich. No, China and America are the same, except in China the Republicans always win.
The legendary Noah Smith makes his China Talk debut alongside longtime guest Matt Klein. We'll be talking China's economy, industrial policy, the 2024 election, and more with two of the sharpest econ substackers in the game. Welcome to China Talk, you two.
Man, you should be a sports announcer. You're too good for the podcast circuit.
As soon as someone offers me that, UFC announcing contract, I will be there tomorrow. But in the meantime, we're stuck talking about the Chinese economy. Matt, what's up with it?
Up might not be the right word I'd use for this. Essentially, there's sort of two perspectives that I would take. One is a much longer term sort of structural perspective of what's really been happening in the past 10, 15 years. And there we've seen basically the Chinese economy gradually slowing down from a peak growth rate in, around the double digits that was reached around 2010, 2011. It's been slowing down pretty consistently before the pandemic to something around like a 6-7% growth rate. And that's really sort of, if you zoom out, that's essentially just where we are now is essentially a continuation of that trend and that process. And then separately, there's what happened with the pandemic and what's been happening more recently with the end of the COVID-0 restrictions. So China, as you and your listeners all know, reacted to the pandemic emerging initially by essentially shutting down large swaths of the economy, literally locking people in homes and so forth. And that was extremely disruptive and repressive, but it did work in the short term in 2020 anyway, at sort of arresting the spread of the virus and allowed a degree of normality to return by the summer of 2020. But then as the virus mutated, it became a lot more contagious. By the time you get to 2022, that wasn't really working. So government officials in China at the local level tried to do this again, places like Shanghai and in Guangzhou, and it just didn't really work to the same extent. You just had much more repression, much more shutdowns. The economy really had a rough time. You get to the end of 2022, there's essentially mass protests about the arbitrariness of this. You have a situation where people are killed because there's a fire in a building. They're not allowed to leave because of COVID restrictions. And, eventually the policy there's a complete turnaround at the end of 2022 saying, okay, we're going to get rid of all restrictions. And the hope was at the time that once that the restrictions were over, there would be presumably a few months of extreme disruption, as a lot of people who had not gotten sick and had not been properly vaccinated would get sick and a lot would die. But that hopefully, if we're looking at sort of the bright side here, that by the end of that, by say like March of this year, things would actually be pretty open, and then the economy would really be able to, all the restrictions would be gone, you'd get a real robust rebound, and wherever the economy should have been absent the pandemic is where we would have ended up relatively quickly. And what's interesting is that didn't really happen. You did have a fair amount of death and disruption in January and February and December. Don't really know what those numbers are, may never know what those numbers really were. But since then, you haven't really had the kind of rebound and growth you would have expected. All the data you'd be looking at that they publish on a monthly basis, things like the retail sales numbers, various measures of industrial production, investment, whatever, not really been doing very well at all. In fact, there's been essentially, if you're looking at things like what is the trend in retail spending, and what has spending been like recently relative to that, it's remarkably poor. There's basically been the idea there'd be some sort of revenge spending bounce back. The kind of thing you saw, by the way, in 2021, we haven't really seen that this year in any meaningful way. And we know it's bad because in addition to just me looking at data and other people looking at the data that are published, there are also a lot of news articles about how the Chinese government, senior officials are trying to figure out what to do about this. And so that's the real indicator that something is bad, because if they think there's a problem, then like they're probably seeing things that we're not seeing here.
So Matt, there was a blockbuster article by Ling Wei in the Wall Street Journal, basically making the case that she is sort of ideologically opposed to like the softness of bailing, of sort of like doing helicopter, throwing money out of helicopters and bailing out and trying to stimulate demand from a consumer perspective, and how this is potentially a major closing off one of the what a lot of Western, but particularly Chinese economists are increasingly saying is like the thing that China needs to do in order to start to get the economy on track in the sort of near term. who knows to the extent to that's true, but like how much would getting over that sort of like ideological hurdle of like actually being like a consumer demand driven economy and not one where this sort of the state support is only flowing towards, you know, semiconductors and electric vehicles or what have you. How much does that open up the aperture for like smart policymaking from a macro perspective?
So first of all, I think that news story is entirely plausible because it's consistent with things we've seen in public, not necessarily that Xi Jinping himself has said, but that other people affiliated, you know, broadly speaking with sort of elite policymaking have said. That they talk about the concern of welfarism, and they say that we don't want to end up like Latin America. They're very explicit about this. That this is what essentially, well, the reason why Latin America didn't develop past a certain point was because the governments just gave people stuff and then they lost the will to work and what have you. That's sort of the official, that's the interpretation from a lot of Chinese
and
sort
just
of policymaking elites.
And just like brief detour, Noah and Matt, is that a reasonable interpretation of the second half of the 20th century?
It's a little extreme.
I will say that the Latin American development model ended up being very different from what China ended up pursuing, but I don't think that necessarily explains. I don't think their interpretation of it necessarily is correct. I think also, even if that is what you think happened in Latin America, the situation in China now is so different from anything that's ever happened there that I don't really think it's a comparable situation. The idea that Chinese workers are, you know, are lazy and not producing enough, and that they're just taking from society. I mean, if we just look at anything that we see about actually what's going on, and the story of the Chinese economy over the past 30 plus years is actually that workers in China have been progressively squeezed, and that all the instruments of state, formal and informal, have been used to take from workers and redistribute purchasing power that workers should have had to go towards local governments and businesses. And the reason they've been able to build up so much infrastructure or choose to build up so much infrastructure and real estate development and so forth is precisely because it's the flip side of taking from people who otherwise would have bought other things. Jordan, you've had on the show, Natalie Hell and Scott Rozelle, and they're talking about, the vast impoverishment of large swaths of rural China. And I mean, this is, I think, the natural flip side of all the, people say, oh, what's the cost of China over investing or what have you, or spending too much investment, not enough consumption? Well, we know what the answer is, right? It's actually, shocking levels of ringworm in children and, not having, corrective vision treatments and things like that, the people not knowing how to read. So that is really the flip side here. And so I think there is this huge ideological problem here. I think there's also a structural problem on top of the ideology, which is that maybe, this is a little speculative, but if you have a very Leninist political system and a way of organizing the world, if you want to have your party being in control of the commanding heights of the economy, because that's how you stay in charge of society, then your natural preference is going to be having economic activity concentrated in things that you can control. So very much at the government level or big businesses or things like that, and not so much having spending power dispersed among lots of consumers who buy what they want, and then have businesses respond to what consumers want. So obviously it's not 100% one or the other, but I think, you can clearly see that over time, that's generally been sort of the way that I think Chinese political economy has evolved. I think it explains a lot of why is it that consumer spending in China is so low as a share of national output. And I think that creates all these other problems, including like, why is real estate such a big thing? I mean, the reason real estate has been so large, residential real estate, isn't because lots of Chinese people need housing. I mean, sure, there are lots of Chinese people that need homes, but the reason this stuff is built is because it's mostly the only way that Chinese people can save money in a way that isn't either. The stock market has notoriously been filled with scams and speculation. Basically, the total return over time is close to zero over many, many years. Put money in the bank, which historically you get basically pitiful interest relative to inflation or growth or anything reasonable. So the only other thing you can put it in is housing. And so that's why Chinese house prices, in terms of, you look at like price per square foot relative, in dollar terms, not even relative income, but just in dollar terms, it's actually pretty close to what it is in the United States, which is insane because the incomes are so much lower there. And that's because, of course, there's a lot more money going in there for these sort of investment saving purposes relative to other things. But that's a function of people not having the ability to consume, as a function of the distribution of income being very skewed. A lot of people buying, housing that hasn't been built yet because it's just where they put their money. And so that's, these are kinds of the bigger, among the reasons why they have this kind of limitations here. And I think that the ideological issues at the top are certainly part of it, but there's a lot of factors that are all sort of combined here, which I think are unfortunately going to be preventing what as you said, economists in China think, or many economists in China think, is sort of the right approach.
The thing that's highly unintuitive to Western observers is this idea that switching to consumption-based service industries would accelerate productivity. In advanced economies, what we've seen is that a long-term shift towards service industries has slowed productivity via the Baumol effect, because service industries inherently have less opportunity for productivity gains than manufacturing. At the point where most developed economies are, manufacturing productivity for the United States, for Japan, grows faster than services. But what I think that this logic flips for a developing country that has suppressed growth of its service industries, because we actually have gotten quite a bit of productivity growth in service industries. We just got it slower, and we got it in the past. And we really never went through a phase where we suppressed service industries. We've had doctors and the Sears catalog for like hundreds of years. Like we've never really repressed service industries. So their productivity, healthcare, right, has grown slowly over time. China has benefited from relatively little of this, which is one reason why their GDP is stuck at, generously a little less than a third of ours, maybe even lower. One reason is because manufacturing productivity tends to converge pretty quickly with the international average. And you see this in, so Danny Roderick, the economist, has some papers showing this. Basically, even in Latin America, even in Africa, anywhere, manufacturing productivity tends to reach the global frontier pretty easily. And for most countries, industrialization is a question of how much manufacturing can you have in your early development. Can you do this sectoral shift, this sectoral allocation where you get a lot of people to work in manufacturing? Well, China absolutely did, and it's arguable that they did this, too much. And so it is possible to go toward, we think, oh, we need more manufacturing because the productivity goes up faster. Well, it's possible to go too far, right? It's possible to do too much manufacturing so that your productivity already converge. Like Huawei phones are not, appreciably worse than the iPhone, right? Or Chinese manufactured products are not appreciably worse. I mean, they're, sometimes they're like a little bit worse because they're a little bit cheaper, lower end of the market stuff. But like, there's not a huge difference in productivity between China and advanced countries in terms of like making stuff in a factory.
Sure.
What there is, their service industries just really suck. And so because instead of service industries, they've tried to substitute things that they thought were like, I don't know, manly, warlike, or just suited their ideological preferences, or suited their political economy of being able to hurl money at the right people. By building too much real estate, by building, I wouldn't say too much infrastructure, but maybe too fast or in the wrong places. But then especially real estate, they just built apartments and apartments and apartments instead of figuring out how to employ people in service industries like, healthcare and insurance and whatnot, and retail, and that's been a problem for the Chinese economy. And so it runs counter to our intuition that they should actually shift towards service industries in order to boost productivity. But the point is, when you're a developing country that's not very good at service industries, but has largely converged in manufacturing, that's kind of what you should do.
I'm just going to briefly add that what's interesting is that despite all these sort of structural restraints and limitations on the Chinese service sector, you nevertheless have seen the emergence of some incredibly successful and globally competitive Chinese software companies, for example. And so, I mean, now this is a situation where, the government sort of pushed back and they don't like the, kids playing too many video games or whatever, but it's still striking that even despite all these things, there clearly is a lot of potential there. It's, it's unfortunate. Like, it's not like, Chinese society is destined to be underdeveloped or anything like that. I mean, clearly it is there. It's just, you have a sort of structural problems with the way the government, what they incentivize and so forth. And it's unfortunate, but it does suggest there's a lot of room for growth if things were different.
Let's take that and sort of come to like the peak China question. And, let's just do this from a sort of like economic growth, like maximizing their potential perspective. I mean, let's say we're sort of like, baking in like roughly the same sort of governance and ideological, economic ideological outlook that we've seen for the past past 10 years for the next 10 years. Does that mean we've hit peak China? Is this sort of radical shift in the narrative about China's future sort of economic place in the world that we've seen from 2020 to now justified, overblown? Noah, what's your hot take?
I think that peak can mean many things. Is China as rich as it will ever get? No, it will get richer than this. Is China, have we seen peak China growth in terms of growth rates? Yes, we absolutely have. They will not return to 10% growth. They will only return to 6% growth very briefly and with heavy data manipulation and massaging. So in that sense, we have seen peak China. The question is, have we seen peak China in terms of its relative sort of economic catch-up to developed countries? In other words, is China going to stabilize at sort of its current place in the economic hierarchy of the world? And I would say that if not now, then pretty close. Then we're pretty much at the peak now. I would say yes, but that's much more open to argument, I think. Because in terms of Japan, with retrospect, we saw peak Japan in the late 80s, right? But it was not clear. That was not necessarily clear until decades later. So it's going to take a while for us to figure this out. I think that what we are seeing is a more nebulous, vague peak in terms of Chinese state capacity, in industrial kind of effectiveness. I think that China is currently capable of doing absolute marvels. And we are seeing those marvels getting done, things that no other country in the world can possibly come close to matching. The fact that they built, the more than half the world's high-speed trains in just a few years. That they have more than half the world's miles of high-speed train. That is incredible. They built it in a decade, and that's just unfathomable. Japan couldn't do that. No one can do that. France couldn't do that. The fact that their car industry exports have gone from basically an also-ran, almost non-existent, to being the world's largest car exporter in, I think, 2 years. That is incredible. No other country can do that. China is currently capable of producing industrial wonders. And in that sense, when people talk about peak, everyone thinks about the decline that comes after the peak. But it's possible to peak and plateau. If you looked at, say, Germany, and you saw, like, in the 1880s, by that time, Germany was already the manufacturing powerhouse of Europe, and one of the manufacturing powerhouses of the world, and arguably the highest quality manufacturer, the manufacturer of the most technologically advanced products on the planet by 1880. But you see, it's not until Nazis, came and messed it up, that you see them really start to decline. Germany was still right at the top all the way up until, the Nazi era. So these countries, and that was over half a century. The countries can have very long, plateaus where they're capable of doing wonders, for many decades before, things like aging or, the shift of industrial clustering to other countries start to catch up with them, right? You can be at that peak for a long time.
You mentioned aging. I think that's a very relevant point for thinking about China's situation. I mean, I completely agree with you that the growth rate peaked, 2010. So people acting now like, oh, China's going to slow down growth. Like, has anyone looked at the numbers? I mean, clearly there's been a sustained slowdown for some time.
Yeah,
it's something that, in fact, right, and in fact, it was something that was desired by Chinese policymakers because they thought it was a problem, that was unbalanced and uneven growth before that. So, yeah, I see some things now. And people are like, oh man, China. It gives you a sense of who's sort of a tourist here. But I also agree that I think it's certainly plausible that in terms of relative position that the Chinese economy may have reached sort of its zenith relative to, say, like the United States. But I think a lot of that is going to be based on a demographic outlook of the number of Chinese of working age, and particularly the number of Chinese in sort of their 40 to 49 age cohort, which people have found repeatedly that's where like most of the productivity comes from. So, congratulations, everyone in their 40s, you're supposed to be contributing your maximum output there. So anyhow, that population has been shrinking a lot in China already. I mean, that peaked in 2013 and is set to fall by like I think the people specifically in their 40s, I believe, if I remember correctly, looking at the last UN World Population Prospects, is projected to fall something like 2/3 between now and the end of the century. And so even though the Chinese population as a whole is supposed to be much more stable, because essentially a lot of people are going to be aging. And so if you look at that, it's very difficult to say, okay, clearly you can have productivity gains to offset some of that. That's the promise of automation and so forth. But we've never seen anything like this before. I think it's going to be very challenging society-wide. Now, the living standards of any individual person in China might still continue to rise. That's certainly possible. But if you're thinking about like relative power from sort of geoeconomic sense or whatever, that's going to be, I think, a big headwind, is the demographic side. Of course, on the productivity side, it's also not clear how much productivity increases we've actually had in China. I mean, there's issues of how you measure productivity, how much of it's attributable to capital deepening or what have you. But there are some estimates that claim that total factor productivity would essentially, if you net out improvements in education and growth in the capital stock, that's actually been essentially flat since like 2007. I don't know if that's right, but there are at least some credible estimates making that argument. I mean, you can't really have a lot of growth going forward if you don't have literally no productivity growth there. So that would be sort of the big challenge. Jordan, when you sent around before we started a list of topics, I was looking through, so I remember I'd written about this, and I found a column from Barron's I've written in early 2020 making this precise point about like, well, maybe it won't, this will be sort of close to the top. Or like 2040 or something. Who knows, right? But it's certainly plausible that from that perspective that peak China. Although I'm sort of reticent to use that term because of what it sounds like it's going to be all downhill from there or whatever. But I think that thinking about what the future is going to hold, there are a lot of situations in the past, we have a period of rapid growth and people say, oh, it's going to go on forever. And then it doesn't, right? I mean, you think about when Khrushchev made his "We will bury you" speech in 1956, and you look at what happened after that. And, there are a lot of ways of measuring this, and there are disputes about whether these measurements are accurate, but you look at the Madison database of GDP per capita across countries. And for the Soviet Union as a share of the United States, you saw a huge convergence right after that, actually. So it looked like he was right. It's like, oh, well, this massive convergence, and it's something like 20 percentage point increase in GDP per capita of the Soviet Union relative to the United States between 1956 and like the mid 1970s. But then it stopped, and then eventually it went down a lot. And if you look at where we are now, just for Russia, not for the Soviet Union as a whole, pre-Ukraine war, it was basically in relative position comparable to where we were in like 1910 relative to the United States. So like that was the end of that. China right now, starting from a much lower base, but seeing a pretty dramatic convergence over the past couple decades. But it could stop. I don't know. Maybe it won't. But I the baseline assumption that countries that are poor are naturally going to keep converging and is something that actually you don't see very often. It's happened a few times and it's noteworthy, but shouldn't be the baseline assumption.
Yeah. So to continue on this sort of Soviet Union analogy, like just because like relative share of global GDP maybe peaked in the 1950s for the Soviet Union doesn't mean that no
70s, no 50s. So sorry. So I was saying he said the speech in 1956, and then from then until 70, maybe I wasn't clear. Until
okay,
76,
gotcha.
The Soviets kept catching up until the late 1970s.
Basically, when they invaded Afghanistan.
That was not necessarily related. That was no.
Yeah.
No, I think related. But it's an interesting.
Oh, right, because so the causation runs the other way, because when you're feeling your oats, you're feeling your strength, you're like, well, I could. Let's take this geopolitical power out for a spin, baby, and see what we can conquer and dominate.
And in fact, the whole from 1956 until then, right? The whole Brezhnev doctrine of, oh yeah, we're going to go in all these other countries and do stuff. And it seemed, yeah, exactly. And then it peaks and then they stop.
Then they stop. This peak came quick. The thing is that I think that we expect these peaks to be over quick because the USSR and Japan, shortly after they peaked, it was only about a decade after they peaked that we started to say, okay, this is a country in decline, relative decline. But I think that's a mistake, because if you go back and look at other powers, the United States lasted at its peak for arguably a century before it went into decline. And then I think that, Germany lasted for half a century. And then you can even go back earlier to that. You look at Britain, I would say Britain lasted arguably a century. And so these peaks can last a long time. The USSR and Japan were kind of special cases, I think. Japan may be a little more relevant than the Soviet Union. In fact, we should talk about Japanification a little bit, Jordan. Soviet Unionification, Sovietification, which doesn't make as handy a term. It's not as cute. But I think that the main analogy there is that capital deepening will only get you so far. And I would like to mention that all of the capital that you've seen China build, all of those just infinite miles of high-speed train, infinite forests of apartment towers, giant gleaming, new factories with robots and stuff like that, that will depreciate. What people don't understand is that capital depreciation really sets in after, 20 years? Physical depreciation. You can amortize your depreciation any time that the government allows you to, but that's just a financial trick. The actual physical depreciation of capital in terms of infrastructure, machinery, and structures happens, after about 20 years. Stuff starts to get really worn out.
Depends how well you built it in the first place, too, right?
Japan built their stuff very, very well. China did not. China is like the United States in that they build quick, shitty, and cheap. I've as an aside, I've often argued that China is the country that is most similar to the United States in the entire world, and that basically, like, people think that they're these two alien civilizations, they're the clash of civilizations. No, it's a similar country. Everyone's just wearing khaki shorts and a t-shirt and Crocs and going to the mall and driving to the mall, and watching, Fox News or whatever and saying, like, my country's great because it's big, and then dreaming big unrealistic dreams of getting rich. No, China and America are the same, except in China the Republicans always win. But anyway, that is a like, stop playing video games. Stop being gay on TV. No, stop being gay. Be manly. Like, no, it's just, welfare is bad.
Japanification. What are your other analogies, Noah? What else
Sorry,
you got?
I went on a little sidetrack rant here, but that's my impression of China. Is it's, but okay, so Japanification. The thing is that most of our narratives about what happened to Japan in the 80s and 90s are incredibly exaggerated and some to the point of being wrong. So Japan was this export powerhouse. No, it had a trade surplus for financial reasons. Its exports as a percent of GDP were always quite low.
Which is like China as it's been since about the past 15 years.
Yes, in the 2000s, China was an export powerhouse. Then after 2008, China's like, no, actually, we're just going to build a bunch of housing and infrastructure instead, and which they did. And so they shifted from being an export powerhouse to being, their exports as a percent of GDP are not that low. It's like 20%, maybe?
I think it's like 15. Or it's
Oh,
maybe
is
it's
it going,
20.
has it gone down?
It might have gone up recently. Well, so the pandemic
since
just
the
changed things a
pandemic,
little
since the
bit. But yeah,
pandemic.
it's been in sort of
That's
15-20% range, which is pretty
Yeah,
low.
okay. That's
but yeah.
getting down toward Japan range, which is not that open an economy. Most of your, India is higher than that. And so exports as a percent of GDP are not that high. It's not export powerhouse, but Japan was never an export powerhouse, really. Japan never had a high rate of exports to GDP as long as we've been keeping track of that, right? They always, Japan's exports to GDP is the highest now that it's been since we started keeping track, I think. And so, they had a trade surplus, but that's net, not total. And so, but what happened with Japan, there was a shift toward real estate, but it was much less in terms of real estate construction, which has always been pretty robust in Japan and remained robust. It was toward real estate finance, which was somewhat like China, but China did that a lot more. If you look at real estate and related industries as a percent of GDP, Japan's peaked in the teens. China's peaked at like almost 30% of GDP, more than twice. So there's just, China in that sense is more Japanified than Japan ever was. And in terms of this real estate crash, Japan had a real estate crash. Japan had a stock crash. A lot of this was related to the way that corporations finance stuff in Japan. And now I've just thought of a new thought, which is approximately sort of truthy, which is that China's burst now is more like it is really more like America, a double version of America's bust in the 2000s than it is like Japan's bust. Because Japan's bust was fundamentally a corporate bust, right? It was corporations were using real estate as collateral to borrow to do industrial expansion for things that they were mostly selling in Japan. that was a process that couldn't continue and was continued too long by a bunch of weird financial practices that Japan had, such as cross shareholding, evergreening of loans, blah 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 blah. So Japan's story was always a lot more subtle and complex than people thought. China's story is much more similar to, our typical story of Japan. You had this country that, where just overbuilt, or just had a massive real estate bubble from just normal people bidding up the prices of housing, right? You really had a banking system sort of failure in China. That in Japan, you had sort of this, you had a lot more complex stuff going on. China fits the Japan story much more cleanly than Japan did.
So I completely agree that there are a lot of differences between China and Japan. And I think that, Noah, you did a very good job explaining like what actually happened with Japan, which is different from, I think, a lot of the common narratives. I do think actually, if you zoom out though, there are actually some interesting similarities, because if we think about why was it that so much of growth in Japan in the 70s and 80s was coming from, this kind of corporate investment funded by borrowing, how so much of the growth in China similarly is coming from the construction and investment of things as opposed to household consumptions financed by different kinds of borrowing. I think there they actually see some similarities. I think there's some very important differences. I mean, Japan was basically a democracy that was not repressive. You didn't have a lot of holistic government policies deliberately trying to, squeeze consumers. But, you did have a situation, there is a similarity, and particularly the way the banking system is structured, of essentially saying, okay, households are going to put money in the banking system. They're not going to get a good return. And then you're going to use that to create some kind of surplus that essentially transfer wealth and purchasing power from households to end users elsewhere, whether it's local governments or businesses or what have you. And that actually is a kind of a similarity there in terms of how that played out. And then, the thing is, you make these investments. In either case, those investments are going to be worthwhile if you actually have some end consumption down the line to justify it. And in both cases, you have a situation where the system that was so good at financing and encouraging that investment perversely made that it more challenging for those investments to end up turning out to be worthwhile because you didn't have the consumer spending, later on.
Japan never really had financial oppression in that sense. In China, everyone saves their money in real estate. In Japan, everyone saved their money in bonds, and that was mostly government bonds. That is due, the stock market was always fine. Like, it was never a joke.
Right.
Like in China, it was always fine. But the reason people saved most of their money in bonds had to do with the fact that Japan has this system where they demolish real estate so it doesn't appreciate, so people put their money in bonds instead, mostly government bonds. It was never financial oppression. The government never did anything to like make this happen. It was just sort of the way things shook out. Given Japan's real estate policies, you couldn't save your money in real estate.
Maybe I'm curious your sense. My understanding is that in prior period, particularly when Japan was growing relatively rapidly, that the interest rates that you'd get on a bank deposit, which was a relatively popular form of saving for households, were unusually low, and that also led to, that created a wedge so that banks could lend at relatively low interest rates relative to growth rates.
That's correct. That's right. But it wasn't because the government made you save in a bank. It was because the government would knock down your house every 20 years and build a new house in its place to improve earthquake safety technology and also possibly to give money to construction companies. I don't know. But the point is that real estate was always a consumer durable, more like a car in Japan. And because the stock market has always been a relatively small piece of savings for anyone, and the stock market was fine in Japan. They had a stock bubble too, at the same time. But the reason Japan had a real estate and land bubble was because of the corporate stuff that we talked about before. The bank deposits were, or let's say bond rates in general, just anything with a fixed interest rate had low interest rates, primarily because you couldn't save your money in real estate, so everyone piled into bonds. So bonds didn't have to like raise interest rates to attract capital, to attract savings. And so it was much more the natural, just outcome of a place that builds a lot of housing. If you have massive expansion of housing supply and such that you can't save your money in real estate, people will go save their money in bonds, which drives down interest rates. And so that's really what happened with Japan. No, but there was also some other stuff like home bias, like people did, the famous carry trade wasn't really nearly as big as people think, and so people wouldn't like save their money overseas, and actually then they started to, which resulted in some weird stuff in the 80s. But let's not get too stuck on Japan. Let's go back to the question of China. China fits this story pretty well, with the financial repression. They really, pushed people toward real estate by making you get a crappy return on bonds. They were like, you're not going to get a good return on your bonds on your bank account. So where are you going to put your money? And the stock market's a joke. So where are you going to put your money? Real estate. And so China did that, whereas Japan almost did the opposite in that it was like, well, you're not going to be able to save money in your real estate because we're going to knock it down every 20 years. So in China, people were forced into saving in real estate, and they saved all their money in real estate. Whereas in Japan, people couldn't save their money in real estate, so they saved all their money in bonds.
So I would just add one more thing about China that's relevant here, which is that the way local governments finance their operations is very much by taking land and selling it, seizing land in various ways and selling it to developers. Right. And that's a large chunk of their operating revenues historically. And so that also creates a big incentive for creating this real estate. And of course, they're not very squeezed. Local governments are generally in China what provide most public services. They're the people who pay for most of the infrastructure investment. And they get, they're getting very squeezed by the situation here with real estate. So the linkage there is very important in explaining, how they ended up in this situation as well. There's a lot of, they for several decades, they've had a very strong incentive for boosting the real estate industry for their own, as essentially a kind of fiscal policy.
The real estate just did so much for the Chinese economy. It was the main way everybody saved their money. It was the way that local governments financed everything. It was the way that the central government did fiscal stimulus whenever there was a threat to the economy. They're basically, and it was like the source of jobs and employment for everybody. But basically, there were three weird ways in which real estate was special to the Chinese economy in ways that it wasn't special to other economies necessarily. And those things all combined. And that's why I always tell everyone real estate is not the only threat. It's not the only thing that slowed China's growth. It's not the only threat facing China now. But it is the reason for this slowdown. This is a real estate-driven slowdown. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at like what's happened immediately in the past few years, there's basically starting in 2021, the Chinese government said we're going to crack down on real estate, and then they have, and that's led to a lot of other things. So in that sense, yes. I think also though, zooming out, why real estate is so important to the Chinese economy is reflective. It's essentially a symptom of these sort of other issues. Right. That we're talking about in terms of if you don't have a consumer sector, if you don't have, you have to have, there are only so many ways to generate GDP growth, which is the target and employ people. So if you rule a lot of those other ones out, you're left with this. And so I think that's like the other sort of deeper reason for why they're in this situation. But yeah, if we're looking at just like the past couple of years, then yes, I mean, you can just very clearly see it's the real estate.
And I would say arguably since 2008.
So let's turn to industrial policy now. So I've done a lot of other shows on China Talk about sort of what have been the reasons that the Chinese electric vehicle and semiconductor industry have been so successful. I'm curious, for your perspective on like, to what extent this is something that Western policymakers should be stressed out about.
I don't think we need to be worried about the long-term, economic, industrial competitiveness piece of this at all. I think that people are going to worry a lot about that, especially in Europe. I think that there is a gigantic freak out in Europe about Chinese, electric vehicles outcompeting Volkswagen, outcompeting the German car industry. That's a thing that's going to happen but I think that in terms of cars, ultimately the world tends toward an equilibrium where most cars are made where they are sold, because cars are very heavy relative to the amount of price they command. The amount of economic value that you ship in a car per kilogram of weight is much, 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 much lower than for, say, processors, right? A processor, can give you a little box of processors can give you more economic value than a car, and it's something like this. Whereas a car I can't lift, right? And so it should work out more. But a car is heavy, and a battery is very heavy, and ultimately it will not. And most cars are made where they are sold. And we look at these graphs of China's exports dominating the world, but we don't, but then you look at exports as a percent of total consumption, and it's not that big. And so ultimately it will take only a small amount of Germany supporting Volkswagen and Volkswagen making some management changes and whatever they need to do, it's going to take only a little bit of that to take the car industry back from China. Because if you look at the history of America and Japan, you know, in the 80s, people were freaking out, oh my God, everyone drives a Japanese car, blah, blah, blah. Fast forward just a couple years, and Japanese cars are the most American of any car. Like Toyota and Honda and Nissan have more American-made stuff in them than GM and Ford by quite a bit, because most cars are heavy, and most cars are made where they are sold, no matter who owns the IP and, like, you know, puts their brand on it. And so in terms of like having a car industry, it's ultimately more about like branding and IP than about where the cars are actually made. They're going to be made close to where they're sold. The semiconductor industry is a very different animal, because semiconductors are very light, very easy to ship, very easy to supply chain, tons of value in that little box of processors. And so that, I think, semiconductor industry is the industry where, and they're also much more, I think, militarily relevant at this point. Although maybe Matt will correct me, but I think that semiconductors are going to be the main sort of arena for competition between, you know, overall, with the car thing being like a little bit of sideshow with like Europe worrying about too many electric car imports.
Yeah, on cars, I think one thing that's also worth noting is that, at least as of now, the growth in Chinese car exports is entirely been a function of the fact that Chinese production of cars has been flat over the past few years, and Chinese domestic demand for cars has gone down. It's not
Right.
actually a
They
situation
dumped
where
the cars.
it's not like they've suddenly increased their total production of motor vehicles. I mean, maybe that will change in the years ahead. I don't know. But like as of, you know, July, August of this year, that's what the numbers are showing. And so that's also some, you know, perspective here in terms of, you know, how this is playing out, right? If you built all this capacity to make cars, you can sell them a lot more cheaply because, you know, your labor costs are lower, et cetera. And then you just squeeze your domestic market, you have an extra, you're like, okay, fine, we'll send them abroad. Like, why not? Right. I mean, like, that's going to be
Super cheap.
The price point, like a BYD, you know, electric vehicle is like what, like 10 grand or something, I think, right? If you can, I mean, that's obviously going to just outcompete a Volkswagen no matter, in any circumstance, right? So it doesn't take a lot. I mean, most of those exports are not going to Europe. They're basically, none of them are going to the US. They're going to third markets, but still, like, I mean, that's sort of the thing there. I mean, historically, the military application of having a car industry is that you could have those factories make tanks. I don't know how relevant or helpful that's going to be going forward, or that how much people should think about that as a point of concern. I don't know. But like, if we're thinking about like the growth of the Chinese auto industry, I mean, it's been growing for a while, but essentially if you look at the production numbers, it's been sort of flat since 2018. So, I mean, and quite frankly, like, we need globally more electric vehicle manufacturing capacity, because if you want to turn over the existing fleet of motor vehicles globally from what it is now, which is overwhelmingly internal combustion engine, towards mostly battery electric vehicles, you're going to need to have way more production than we have now. Most new production as a share of the existing fleet is pretty small, right? Just for anything. So if you want to turn over the whole fleet, like that's, so the fact that you're having more production is not itself bad. I mean, I think it's, if you're a policymaker in a country that's not China, you want to make sure that you maintain your own domestic production, because there's good things for that. But I mean, the fact that China's producing more is not inherently a problem. I mean, I also don't think it's inherently a problem that, you know, China's producing, or maybe producing, you know, functional, you know, commercial aviation. I mean, you know, the idea that you have a Boeing Airbus duopoly, it's not obvious why that's inherently good for the world. I mean, I think it's good for, you know, the U.S. to have the ability to manufacture airplanes and have that supply chain and everything in the U.S. But I also don't think that there's any reason why you want to have less production in total or less competition. So I think that we can have a sort of positive sum view of this. And if it takes industrial policy and China's part to get there, or for that matter, on our part to prevent that, you know, the destruction of what currently exists, then that's fine. I mean, you can look at semis too, right? I mean, the semiconductor industry is sort of, perhaps more than any other industry, one that wherever it exists requires extreme levels of government subsidies. People say, oh, there's a comparative advantage for building semis in Taiwan. It's like, okay, well, Taiwan is basically a jungle island with no industry whatsoever, you know, 100 years ago. I don't know why we talk about like comparative advantage in building the most high-tech components ever. Like they just made a lot of effort to make it happen, right? You change your comparative advantage. So, I mean, you can see that in all sorts of, you know, things. And so if you want to have a semiconductor industry in your country, like it just, for some reason, apparently requires lots of subsidies and other things. And
dirty little secret, half the time when people claim a comparative advantage, underneath it is a racial stereotype.
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
There's a pull quote. There's a
which is
full quote. I'm
which
gonna
is
tweet
downstream
that.
of government policy from like 150 years ago, I think is the
Well, I mean, in reality, government policy matters a lot, but in people's minds, like Taiwanese people, and by extension, Chinese people are able to comprehend how semiconductors work in a way that, like, just like dumb people in Arizona are not. And for some reason, I guess they think Japanese people aren't. But it's dumb, but people think this way. People think like, oh yeah, those Taiwanese are just really, really good at chips, and like, I mean, yes, but it's a learned skill, and the reason the incentive for learning was there was because of government policy. It's not like Taiwanese people are born knowing how to do semiconductor engineering.
Let's talk about 2024. I don't think I've talked about it.
That's next year.
Oh,
Holy shit, that's next year, 2024.
I mean, or if you want to be, it's 2.5 months, right? Or 3 months.
It
Three
is
and a half.
almost upon us. I
So-
can remember when 2024 was cyberpunk future, and you know what? Honestly, the present feels like that cyberpunk future that I imagined for 2024 when I was like a kid in the 90s.
with geriatric presidents ruling
always.
over us all.
Well, Blade Runner was set in 2019, right? I mean, wasn't that?
Yeah.
Like, how much does a Trump presidency change any of the sort of like relative national power, global influence, economic growth trend lines that we've been talking about for the past 45 minutes?
The answer is who knows, because Trump is a chaos agent and who knows what he'll do. We don't know that a next Trump presidency would be like the last Trump presidency. What we saw in the last Trump presidency was essentially two things. Trump would start culture war fights, and Trump would vaguely direct economic policy in the direction of things that like people yelled about in the early 90s when Trump was at his peak of wealth and influence. And so Trump was very much stuck in the early 90s. So Trump tried to start a trade war with Japan, which hasn't been a competitive threat for like decades. It's like Trump is dumb, and so he took all these things that he saw in the early 90s, and he got Robert Lighthizer to go, make some tariffs and like yell at some of these countries. And so and then in the background, we had the security state building the foundation for the Biden policies, so for export controls, that was come up. It was the security state that came up with that, especially deemed exports. That's actually the big one that we never talk about. And it was, or CFIUS, investment restrictions, that was all the security state that came up with that. So while Trump was like railing against the deep state or whatever, it was the security services that were actually making his China policy, or at least the parts of it that would really endure and have an impact. And the military, the military was thinking about this. They were very much thinking about the balance of technology between the United States and China. And so we could see that again. Also, the military ran Operation Warp Speed, which is why it worked. But we could see that again. Or we could see Trump being completely controlled by foreign, by like the Axis powers here, Russia and China. And we could see, Trump basically intentionally trying to sabotage any attempts to compete with China, or sabotage, like remove export controls, blah, 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 claiming he'd made a deal with Xi Jinping, or like, just some whatever bullshit, because someone is slipping him this idea from within his administration, and he's a geriatric president as well, so he's going to be probably weaker, I would say, in a second term, and more susceptible to people like whispering in his ear like ideas to do. He was somewhat susceptible to that this first time, but more this time. So my guess would be that that China and Russia are going to get their guys in there and have him drop export controls, and have him basically drop attempts to economically or to militarily / economically compete with China, despite the fact that he ran on like an aggressive anti-China platform in 2016. I think he'll pivot. I think that guys will whisper in his ear to like drop all this stuff. That's my guess, but who knows? He's a chaos agent, so it's fundamentally an unknown quantity. It's sort of a roll of the dice.
Yeah, I would say based on what we saw from the last time that he was in office and what he said in the past few years, I mean, one thing that I think is interesting is that on China, despite rhetoric that was very hostile, he did repeatedly say he was friends with Xi Jinping. He mostly blamed his predecessors rather than anything the Chinese government had done. He went out of his way to basically give China carte blanche to do what the Chinese government wanted to do in Tibet and Hong Kong and in the Uyghur parts of the country. So the idea that Trump is tough on China is, that's people sort of falling for a certain set of rhetoric rather than actual policy. things that occurred.
I think personnel is going to be really interesting and weird in a Trump 2024, because like I have no idea like who is left, who is going to take, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, or National Security Advisor, or Secretary of Defense. I mean, Matt Pottinger, right? Like he quit on January 7th.
You need to get him on the show, by the way, but
it's in the works. I think Noah, the sort of like authoritarian, curious thing, was, obviously like very aggressively resisted by the deep state. But like if like he decides to fire the entire federal government, and like the folks he hires to lead these shelled out agencies are just like, I don't know, like wing nuts. It's really uncertain. You could bring in folks who want to start World War III with China. You could bring in folks who couldn't care less about anything revolving like America's role in East Asia.
The other thing I think that relates to this, and it looked like it's the other side of the world, but to the extent that I think presumably and not just Trump, but probably many of the Republicans who are currently running would be relatively pro-Russian and want to pull back any kind of support there. I mean, you figure that one of the main foreign policy accomplishments of the Biden administration has been getting Europe and the US, the G7, extended, basically all on the same page. That would be undone probably. And that would have a lot of consequences for a lot of things, including for the US relationship with China. And more important is the US ability and the ability of the democracies in general to actually project power, because you talk about like the U.S. being in relative decline to global GDP or whatever. If you think about the U.S. as the leader, the first among equals of a large coalition of sort of like-minded countries, that group as a whole is overwhelmingly powerful compared to any other potential grouping in the rest of the world. But that only works if all those countries are basically willing to coordinate and be on the same page. So if you don't have that, which seems like a highly likely possibility, then you open up a lot of potential problems. And that is, I think, another thing to be concerned about above and beyond all the points that you and Noah mentioned.
Noah, like how do you do what you do? So Noah, like Matt and I write like one thing a week. Matt writes like 1.5 things a week. You're cranking out like very high quality content, not all of which I agree with, but like very cogent takes and explainers 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a week if you're like really going at it. Like talk me through your process, methodology. Like how can the rest of the world learn from the Noah Smith production function when it comes to explaining things about Asia and the economy and US politics and God knows whatever else you write about? And
I don't make my own graphs. And Matt makes his own graphs. So basically that takes a whole lot of time, but I will say Matt's graphs are amazing. And you should definitely read his blog, even just for the graphs. But of course, it's great in general, and you should read it. The answer is that I don't know. If you just don't have anything else to do with your time, then maybe you spend all your time just reading about various, a million different topics, and then get a functional literacy with a lot of those topics. And so I think a lot of it is the fact that I don't have kids, I don't have anything else to do. And so I'm just like reading this stuff kind of obsessively all day. But also, I would say that the key to writing a lot is to get annoyed a lot and to just be like, okay, this is wrong. This needs correcting. This is wrong. It's that old comic of someone has said something wrong on the internet. That is my entire reason for existence. Like, that's why I do what I do. It's not for money. It's not for love. It's not to like help the world, blah, blah, blah. It's because someone has said something wrong and they must be corrected now. I'm half joking, but that is, like a desire to think by engaging with other points of view is an important part of the motivation.
And I feel like, that opens you up to being comfortable. I don't know. I feel like Matt and ours, like Matt, the threshold that Matt and I have for like having an opinion on something and like the degree of, I don't know. I don't want to say degree of confidence. Yeah. Like maybe you're just like more confident and comfortable having takes on stuff. But I feel like I really need to like build myself up and like psych myself to be like, all right, I'm going to have an opinion and put it online. But this must be just innate, or can I like grow this in myself? Like, is there a cultivation routine that I should, engage in to like be more comfortable, like having takes on things?
Well, no. So the joke, which is also the joke of the name of my blog, No Opinion, is that the vast majority of things I just don't have an opinion about. And the thing is that anything that exists that I have an opinion on, you will have read my opinion on, because I write about so many different topics, right? So I have so any opinion that I have, you will know. On all the other stuff I don't write about, it's not like I have some secret opinion that I'm concealing. I just didn't have an opinion. So I write 100% of the opinions I have, and then just don't have opinions on most of the other stuff. And then, so like the key is, as soon as you have an opinion, like, write it and write why you had it. And I think that, not to segue too much, but I think that takes care of the epistemic confidence idea too. And some bloggers try to say epistemic confidence low, epistemic confidence high. No one understands what that even means, much less believes that that's your actual level of epistemic confidence, right? So instead, so like Scott Alexander, no one, it's a noble effort, but no one trusts it. And so instead, what you have to do is lead people through your thought process. Show them how you arrived at your opinion that you have in your writing, and then they'll know when you're just going out on a limb and tossing something out versus when there's something you know a lot about. Because when there's something you know a lot about, you'll show them that you know a lot about it, because you go through this process of showing them how you arrive at this opinion. That's my style of writing. It's like it's an extended stream of consciousness style, where I'm just telling you, like, I decided that the new Huawei phone doesn't mean that export controls are a failure, and here's how I got to that decision, and then I just sort of lay it out. That's what I do in today's post, if you want to check that out. But then most of my posts are basically like that, and I think that means that I'm very efficient with the opinions I do have.
That was gold.
Gold in what way?
I don't know. I just like I don't know. I feel like I have to. There's something in my writing where I feel like I have to hide that, and I have to be like, oh no,
more than me though. My perception of you is like that you're just like the amount.
Well, but I think what I do is like a lot of what I do is like I do like translations, or I do like summaries of other things. It's like it's less like Jordan Schneider's view of the situation. I have guest columnists and stuff.
View.
What?
When I read you translating those things or reporting those things, I see it as Jordan Schneider's view, even if you don't see it that way. So Here I am thinking that you're tossing out a million opinions a second, and you don't think you've tossed out an opinion at all. You just think you shared a link. I'm like, oh, Jordan Schneider says this is right.
If you confuse Jordan Schneider with Chairman Rabbit, that's interesting.
I never eat Chairman Rabbit. It's too high output, but I approve of the rabbit. The rabbit is good. But no, Jordan, everyone else thinks that you are an opinion machine. They already think you're doing it.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess I'll keep going on my merry way then.
Yeah, you're already doing it. I mean, like, your stuff sounds more opinionated than Bill Bishop. The very famous, well-known China pundit who puts out a huge amount of output. He feels like someone who's just like reporting the news, and whereas you feel somewhat reporting the news, but a little more toward the opinion side than him. So I'd say you're already doing what I do. So I wouldn't necessarily ask how I do it, because you do it.
Okay. Yeah. I think we'll call it there. Noah, do you have a song to take us out on, reflecting your work process in terms of the Chinese economy, or a Trump 20, or a second Trump term? Take your pick for inspiration.
It's the end of the world as we know it.
I swear to God, literally half of the guests I ask, that's the song that they give me, which I think is like, does that have to be the China Talk theme? It's too depressing.
No, because I can't sing the Who's Wolf Totem, because I can't sing in Mongolian. That's the real one. All right, that's the song. Wolf Totem by the Who.
Noah Smith of No Opinion, Matt Klein of
10,000 of us will strike you with the power of heaven.
Part of China Talk.